many were here last week or were somewhere else at the time? I got you guys again. How many were not here last week? Not here last week. Whoa, wow. Like half of us. Okay. What we started with, well, let me back up. Let me just say that this program, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, is turning into a curriculum. And the curriculum is designed for homeschool or not just homeschool. In fact, we've got two curriculums, one coming out for homeschool and another one coming out for just anybody in a church or people that just want to go through it in their Sunday school or a Bible study or that kind of thing. And so we're filming these 30-minute segments on each part of the book. And last week we did 4 segments, and tonight we're going to do 4 segments. You say, oh, that's 2 hours. It'll be fun, don't worry. And we're going to take breaks and all that. But we're going to do 4 about 30-minute segments, give or take 5 minutes. And last time we did 4 of these segments. As I say, tonight we're going to do 4 more. And we said, just as a matter of review, that there's only 4 questions you need to answer in the affirmative to say that the Bible is true. If you answer yes to these 4 questions, you can show beyond any reasonable doubt that the Bible is true. What are the 4 questions? These are the 4 questions. Now, that is some pretty grooving music, isn't it? That actually comes from our TV show, which is on every Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. and 1 a.m. if you're an insomniac on DirecTV channel 378. How many people here have DirecTV? Can I see your hands, please? DirecTV. Okay, 8 of us. Come on, why not the rest of us? Friends don't let friends watch cable. If you want to get I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, you got to get DirecTV. Actually, that's not really true. If you go to this website, crossexamine.org, that's our website, at those times, and click on TV show, you can watch it live. And what we do is we present evidence for Christianity and we cross-examine ideas against it. We also have radio every Saturday morning, 10 a.m., 144 stations around the country. That is podcasted and is broadcast, I should say, on the internet. So if you go to our website, you can see what those radio stations are. You can just go to iTunes and listen to it. In fact, yesterday I did a program with my friend Bob Cornuke, who helped discover the anchors of Paul's shipwreck off of Malta. Very interesting show. So if you're interested in that kind of archaeology thing, you want to check out the program from yesterday. Now, why are these the 4 questions? As a matter of review, for people who weren't here last time, does truth exist? Well, of course, the Bible can't be true if there is no truth. If it's just true for you but not for me, or all truth is relative. Of course, if there is no truth, then any book written by an atheist can't be true either, right? I mean, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins can't be true if there's no truth. And last time, in one of the 4 segments, we pointed out that anybody who claims there is no truth is uttering a self-defeating statement. In other words, if somebody were to say to you, there is no truth, you would ask them what? Is that true? Right? And we went through a whole number of these self-defeating statements, and we pointed out that relativism and postmodernism are false. The second question, does God exist? Obviously, the Bible can't be true if God doesn't exist. But we started last time, and we'll finish tonight, 3 arguments for the existence of a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator. These 3 arguments are taught in the Bible, but you don't need the Bible to know them. And tonight we're going to finish the arguments and show you that this theistic God, this being who's beyond the world and who created the world and sustains the world, really does exist, and you don't even need the Bible to know he exists. Okay? The third argument, or the third question I should say, is, are miracles possible? Again, the Bible can't be true if miracles are not possible. I'm going to show you tonight that not only are miracles possible, but the greatest miracle in the Bible has already occurred, and we have scientific evidence for it. We're going to get to that tonight when we get to segment number 3. We're going to talk about miracles. I'm not going to do any miracles. Derwin is going to come in and do miracles tonight. At least he told me he was. If he doesn't show up, he's a liar. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just going to talk about miracles, and we're going to see that miracles are possible because God does exist. Then the fourth question is the question we're all driving at. Is the New Testament true? The New Testament doesn't have a prayer. If truth doesn't exist, God doesn't exist, or miracles are not possible. But if truth exists, God exists, and miracles are possible, then we can see if we have an accurate, historically reliable account of miracles occurring in the first century to a man named Jesus and his apostles in the 27 handwritten Greek manuscripts we now call the New Testament. Do those people, or do these documents, I should say, did they tell us the truth about what happened 2,000 years ago? Or were they written by religious people who had an axe to grind? They embellished it, they made it up, you can't trust it. We're going to see tonight, at least we're going to start to see tonight, that the documents are indeed true. Now, when you look at that fourth question, you may go, well, what about the Old Testament? Do you believe the Old Testament's true? Yes. If the New Testament's reliable, you get the Old Testament thrown in. Why? Who's in the New Testament that can authenticate the Old Testament? Jesus. If Jesus really is God, as the New Testament documents claim he is, now that's a big if, but if he really is God, whatever God teaches is true. Jesus taught the entire Old Testament is the Word of God, so if the New Testament's reliable, you get the Old Testament thrown in. Okay, that's kind of the big picture. Now, the book goes into a lot more detail than these four questions. These are the main four questions, but the book has actually a 12-point case that goes into why Christianity is true, with these four questions I just mentioned being the primary 4 points. Okay, if you want to get the book and you want to get the DVD set that goes with it, it goes into a lot more depth than what we can even do here tonight. And I want to point out, by the way, that we have books back there tonight. We didn't have them last night, but we have them, or last week. We do have them tonight. So if you're interested in getting a book or a DVD set, all the proceeds will go to feed needy children. Mine. Okay, just so you know. My wife and I have 3 kids. 2 of them are in college, so we need some help. In fact, the oldest one's already graduated. They all went to the University of South Carolina. We live in North Carolina, but they all went to South Carolina. The oldest one's already graduated. He went through Air Force ROTC, and now he is an Air Force officer in Las Vegas. He's an intelligence officer for the guys that fly the drones. Did you know that all the drones that are flown in the war zones right now are flown from Las Vegas? And you thought there was no real-world application for Xbox. There is. The second son is in Air Force ROTC, and Lord willing, he will graduate on May 5th this year. And he's going to flight school in Del Rio, Texas, as an Air Force pilot. The third son's not in the Air Force, but he is down at South Carolina, and he's been there for about 1.5 years now. So for about the past 18 months, my wife and I have been empty nesters. Yeah, it took us a while to get used to that. About 10 minutes. Yeah, that's how long it took to change the locks. Actually, no, they're great kids. We love them. But the house stays clean when the kids are gone. You'll realize that when they go. Anyway, there's our website, crossexamine.org. Now, last week, we stopped right here at does God exist? In fact, we were in the middle of this argument, the design argument. We had done the argument from the beginning of the universe. And if the universe had a beginning, then there must be a beginner. And if the universe had a beginning, meaning space, time, and matter had a beginning, then the cause must be beyond space, time, and matter. In other words, it must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. And then we looked at the design of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe. And we also looked at the fine-tuning and design of life. And we are now about to take a detour. Because the detour is what we call Lesson 5, What About Evolution? Now, when I do this program, and I do it all over the country, normally at college campuses. Tomorrow night I'll be on a college campus in Albany, New York, and I'll be going through this material. I don't even touch on evolution. Why do you think I don't? Because at the end of the day, it's really irrelevant to whether or not Christianity is true. If evolution, macroevolution is true, Christianity could still be true. I would think biblical inerrancy would be false, but Christianity could still be true. God could still exist, and Jesus could have still risen from the dead, even if macroevolution is true. Now, I hesitate, or I don't want you guys to think I think macroevolution is true. I don't. I'm just saying if it were true, it wouldn't mean that Christianity is false. It would give us problems for biblical inerrancy because Adam and Eve were created out of the dust, right? But it wouldn't mean that Christianity is false. I'm about to give you some reasons why I think macroevolution is false, but even if it were true, it wouldn't matter to the fact that God exists and Jesus rose from the dead. However, it does hang people up, so let's go through a little bit about macroevolution. And I have to leave a lot out. There's a lot more in the book than I can cover here in the next 30 minutes. But let me start with Piltdown Man. Have you ever heard of Piltdown Man? Piltdown Man was a 1912 discovery in Piltdown, England. And it was in the British Museum. They reconstructed the fragments of a skull and jawbone, and they held it as the link between ape and man. This was supposed to be the so-called missing link. Well, what do you think happened with Piltdown Man? It was revealed as a hoax in 1923. It was a combination of a human skull, orangutan jaw, and chimpanzee teeth, but the scientific community did not concede it was a hoax until 1953. It took them 30 years to admit that it wasn't the missing link. Now, why do you think they would take so long not to admit it was a hoax? In fact, it might be that they were just seeing what they wanted to see. You see this man right here? That's Antony Flew. Antony Flew was one of the greatest philosophical atheists of the last century. In fact, he wrote the article in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Atheism. He was the atheist hero. Well, in the early 2000s, Antony Flew became a deist. What's a deist? Somebody who believes that God created the universe and then left it. He didn't become a Christian, but he said there has to be an intelligence out there. And you know how he came to this? Because of the DNA evidence, because of the incredible complexity of life. He said, there's got to be intelligence out there. And he always prided himself on saying, I'm going to follow the evidence where it leads. And what do you think the atheist said when he wrote a book called There Is a God? The atheist called him senile, right? But he was just following the evidence where it leads. Now, the next thing I'm going to put up here, you may say, what does this have to do with evolution? The O.J. Simpson trial. Some of you are too young to remember the O.J. Simpson trial, but back in 1994, O.J. Simpson was accused of murdering his former wife and her boyfriend. And here was the evidence regarding O.J. Simpson. Simpson's blood was at the scene, only a 1 in 170 million chance it's not Simpson's. Goldman, Brown, and Simpson's blood were in Simpson's Bronco. You remember the famous Bronco chase, the high-speed, low-speed chase through L.A.? Well, all their blood was found in that Bronco. The glove at the scene had blood from all three and matched the glove at Simpson's house. The bloody footprints from a rare brand of size 12 shoes that Simpsons owned were found at the scene. Very rare shoes. I think there were only like 200 made in the whole world, and they were found at the scene. Finally, Brown's blood was on Simpson's socks, and there's a 1 in 21 billion chance it wasn't her blood. Other than that, it was her blood. Okay, question. Does science tell us Simpson is guilty? No, it does not. Why not? Science just gives you the numbers. You then have to make an interpretation, right? All data needs to be interpreted. It doesn't say he's guilty. It's just giving you the evidence. Now, 10 years after, NBC did a survey to try and figure out what people thought about O.J. Simpson's guilt or innocence 10 years later. And here's what they found. 77% believed Simpson was guilty. However, in the survey, they noted there was an ethnic divide, that 87% of whites believed he was guilty, but only 27% of blacks perceived he was guilty. Now, why would that be? Are people just seeing what they want to see? I'm not trying to make any racial comment here. I'm just showing you what the survey was. Why was there such a disparity? Because everybody interprets the evidence based on their worldview. And you've got to discover whether you have the true worldview or not. I'm not making any claim as to whether or not Simpson was guilty or not. I'm simply pointing out that people view the evidence guilty or differently and come up with a different interpretation. How about global warming? You know this hockey stick thing here? Turns out it's not true. And you remember a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, it was revealed that what people were doing, they were cherry-picking data. Some of the scientists were so behind global warming, they were cherry-picking the data to show this hockey stick. They called it a trick to hide the decline, that actually temperatures were going down, but they used a trick to make it look like they were going up. They were claiming, or some critics were claiming, they were using a defective algorithm, that they were hiding data, and that they were actually blacklisting dissenters. That they were saying, if you don't agree with global warming, we're going to come after you. We're going to blacklist you. And by the way, that's going on right now when it comes to macroevolution. If you don't think so, you can just watch the movie Expelled, because it's all about academic freedom. How people who claim that there might be intelligence out there behind life are being expelled from the academy. They're not getting tenure, they're getting fired, they're not getting grant money. Whereas the people who do say that it's got to be a natural cause, that evolution is true, are getting all those things. So there's a lot more to this than meets the eye. Are people just seeing what they want to see? You thought science was objective, didn't you? You're wrong. Science is only as objective as the scientists, because science doesn't say anything, scientists do. In fact, remember this from last week? This is an amoeba. And the Darwinists say maybe this could have come together by natural forces without intelligent intervention. And when other people look at it and they go, wow, there's 1,000 volumes of encyclopedia worth of information in there, people like me will say, well, that's got to be intelligence. Who's right? Well, I can tell you one thing. It doesn't say made by God or made by natural forces on it, right? You have to look at the data and make an interpretation. Now we're going to look at the data, and I'm going to let you make your interpretation as to whether or not you think macroevolution is true, okay? And there are basically, I know this is a complicated topic, but at the end of the day, there's really only two main arguments for macroevolution. You can put all the arguments that people come up with for macroevolution, most, not all, but just about all the arguments for macroevolution, and put them in one of two categories. Category number one, small adaptive or small adaptations lead to new species. This is called from micro to macroevolution. We see small adaptations in creatures, and you get enough of these small adaptations, they're ultimately going to wind up and be a big new species. It would move from one species to another species, and I need to point out right here that it's even controversial what the word species means. So there's controversy there. Secondly, similarities in structure, this is called homology, and DNA are evidences of a common ancestor. And we'll get to that a little bit later. We're going to start with number one, that small adaptations lead to new species, that micro can be turned into macro. And for a real popular treatment of this, we're going to go to National Geographic in 2004. They put a cover story out in 2004, and they asked the question, was Darwin wrong? What do you think their answer was? Darwin was right, okay? He was right. Now, what do you think their best evidence was? I'm about to show it to you. Are you ready? Here's their best evidence. In fact, this was, quote-unquote, the centerfold of the evidence, the centerfold of the article. Here it is. You said, what? Why do they have a bulldog up there? Why do they? Because according to them, dog breeding is an example of evolution. Dog breeders can take one type of dog and with a little genetic variation can ultimately create all these different types of dogs. And the point here is that if dog breeding is an example of evolution in a short period of time, think of what macroevolution can do over a long period of time, or what's called natural selection. Okay, it seems maybe rational on the face of it, but there's a big but here. What's the big but that nobody is seeing on the evolutionary side? Well, it's still a dog, yeah. The point here is breeders are intelligent people. They are trying to get a dog to turn into another kind of dog, still a dog. They're using all their intelligence to go in a particular direction. And when they do that, they meet genetic limits. They can get dogs as small as a Chihuahua and as large as a Great Dane. But at the end of the day, they still have dogs. Okay? And they're using all their intelligence. So if intelligent breeders meet genetic limits, why should we expect non-intelligence to exceed those limits? Do you see that you cannot look at this evidence without using reasoning skills? The evidence needs to be interpreted, just like the OJ evidence, just like the global warming evidence, just like the Piltdown Man evidence. It needs interpretation. and you have to use your reasoning skills to try and discover whether the argument they're making is good or not. I don't think it's a good argument. It's a bad analogy. So what I'm saying here is we all agree on microevolution, but I think macroevolution, without any intelligent intervention, doesn't appear to be correct. I don't think it can happen. It doesn't seem to be anyway, because we meet genetic limits. In fact, some will say, well, just give evolution more time. If you give evolution more time, one day we're going to figure out that macroevolution can occur. Well, we've tried to give it more time. We've used experiments, or we've done experiments on fruit flies, because fruit flies have a very short generational lifespan, and you can work on fruit flies and try and manipulate them so you could maybe get another kind of creature. And what do you got after you've been manipulating them for so many generations? You still have fruit flies. Now, you may have mutant fruit flies. They've created some fruit flies that have wings coming out of their heads, but they're still fruit flies. And Richard Linsky at Michigan State University for about the past 25 or 30 years has been doing experiments on E. coli bacteria to try and see if he could get E. coli bacteria to evolve. And he has gotten some minor changes in E. coli bacteria, and he thinks this is evidence for macroevolution. Now, due to the generational lifespan of E. coli bacteria, 25 or 30 years of working on E. coli bacteria would be like 1 million years of human evolution. And after 1 million years, comparatively to human evolution, what does Richard Linsky at Michigan State still have in his petri dishes? He still has E. coli bacteria. He can't break the genetic limit of E. coli bacteria. In fact, Darwin, one picture is worth 1,000 words, they say. I wonder if that means that one word is worth 1,000th of a picture. But anyway, you remember Darwin's finches? Okay, Darwin observed beak changes in finches, and this is where he got the whole idea of adaptation from. But what no one ever seems to point out, or very few people seem to point out, is Darwin always had finches, and the only thing that changed was the proportion of the large-beaked finches to the small-beaked finches. When it was a dry year, the beaks were larger on the finches, and when it was a wet year, they were shorter. Why? Because you didn't have to go as deep in a wet year to get seeds if you're a finch. But if in a dry year, you had to go deeper to get seeds, so your beak was longer. But Darwin always had finches, and the only thing that changed was the proportion of the finches, the large beak to the small beak. He always had finches. Notice that the beak depth changed with the weather. In other words, you start with finches and you end with finches, but the origin of finches is never explained. This is why, if you want a nice way of saying this, natural selection can explain the survival of a species, but natural selection can't explain the arrival of a species. Where did finches come from to begin with? That is never explained. Where do finches come from? Do you think those things just occurred by natural forces? I don't think so. Well, I'll let you make up your mind. But that's what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that micro can be extrapolated to macro. When we notice that even microevolutionary changes are not directional. They change with the environment. They change with the weather. Things always come back to the mean, just like the finches always came back to the mean. Now, the second major area that evolutionists say point to macroevolution is similarities in structure, called homology, and DNA, that these are common evidences of a common ancestor. I should say these are evidences of a common ancestor. And we'll start with DNA first, and we'll go to our friend Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion, the most popular atheist in the world today. Richard Dawkins was asked by Philip Johnson, the man who wrote the groundbreaking book about 20 years ago called Darwin on Trial. Johnson was an attorney at UCal Berkeley. He wasn't a biologist. But he pointed out that the problems with macroevolution are logical. They're not evidentiary. We look at the evidence for macroevolution, and then we have to make an interpretation. And he noticed that many of the philosophical assumptions and much of the reasoning processes that Darwinists were using to back up their theory were faulty. And so he wrote the book, saying this does not appear as it seems, because these basic interpretation errors are being made, and these basic reasoning errors are being made by the Darwinists. So he wrote Dawkins and he said, hey, Dr. Dawkins, what's your best evidence for macroevolution? Just bottom line me, if you will. And here's what Dawkins wrote back. The reason we know for certain that we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. What's he basically saying? He's saying, look, man, we all have DNA. And you've heard the story before, right? Depending on how you look at DNA similarity is about 96% between apes and humans, although that's controversial now. But it's also about 90% between mice and humans. And the closer you get to humanity with apes or chimpanzees or primates, you appear to have DNA most similar to humanity. And this is supposed to show that we have a common ancestor. It's quite possible Dawkins is right. What does science tell us? Science tells us we have a common genetic code. What do we have to do as scientists? We have to take that data and interpret it and try and figure out what's the best explanation for why we have a common genetic code. Is one possibility we have a common ancestor? Yeah, Dawkins could be right. What's the other possibility he's not even thinking of? Anyone? We have a common creator. DNA similarity could be evidence of a common designer or creator rather than a common ancestor. Similar structures often have a similar blueprint. Why? I mean, what would the evidence have to look like at the DNA level for Dawkins to say, well, we're not ancestrally related? Would the DNA have to be 50%? Would it have to be 25% similar? I mean, it seems arbitrary to what he's saying here. We simply don't know. But you know what? Dawkins has already ruled out the only other possibility from natural causes. What's the other possibility for a natural cause? Is an intelligent cause, right? A non-natural cause. Dawkins has philosophically ruled that out before he's even looked at the evidence, which means what? The only conclusion he can come to is it's got to be a natural cause. Evolution must be true. Again, this is a matter of interpreting the evidence. You know what? Similarity is not the problem for Darwinists. It seems to me that Darwinists must explain the vast dissimilarity between living things. The bee, the octopus, the Venus flytrap, mildew, the peacock, the porcupine, the human are all related according to Darwinists. How did we get this great diversity of life without intelligence? Where did this come from? I think you have to have more faith, interpreting the evidence as I look at it. You have to have more faith to believe that there's no intelligence behind all this. Do you know that you are supposed to be related to the mildew on your shower floor? According to Darwinism. Do you know, and this isn't often talked about because Darwinists have no real idea of how this could occur, but we're related to plants too. They never talk about plant evolution, but they think all life is the result of some natural process. I think you have to have more faith to believe that than just to believe there's intelligence out there. Now, let me show you one other thing. Remember, I just put this quote up here from Dawkins. Do you want to see the entire quote? Look at this. The reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. Here's the remainder of the quote. My philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism is true, but I would prefer to characterize it as a philosophical commitment to a real explanation as opposed to a complete lack of an explanation, which is what you espouse, talking to Philip Johnson again. In other words, Dawkins is admitting he is philosophically committed to naturalism. He's philosophically committed to only one possibility. He has ruled out the only other possibility. He's put on the red glasses and wonders why everything looks red. Well, look, man, if you're not open to the only other possibility, that's a philosophical conclusion, not one based on the evidence. Notice the intelligent design people are saying it could be a natural cause. It could also be an intelligent cause. Why don't we follow the evidence where it leads? In fact, if you look at this, what Dawkins is doing, he's ruling out intelligence beforehand. He's begging the question. He's assuming what he's trying to prove. In fact, this is called circular reasoning, which is what we're going to get to here in just a minute. And you know what else is often never even addressed by Dawkins and his colleagues, evolutionists? Where did the genetic code come from to begin with? We talked about this last time. DNA is a code. It's like a software code. Where do codes come from? They come from minds. In all our prior experience, codes come from minds. We talked about this last time, as I mentioned. And if you really want to go deep on this issue, I highly recommend you get that book right there by Stephen Meyer called Signature in the Cell. DNA is a genetic code. And in you, your genome has about 3 billion letters in it. They all have to be in a certain order for you to be who you are. It takes more faith to believe that resulted by natural forces without intelligence than just to say there has to be intelligence out there. Einstein himself said, the man of science is a poor philosopher. And I think that when you look at this data and you interpret it in such a way as to say only a natural cause could be possible, that's just poor philosophy. And you're going to come to an incorrect conclusion, in my view, if you say that. I think we ought to follow the evidence where it leads. And I think the evidence leads to intelligence. Because in all our prior experience, we see that codes, particularly codes 3 billion letters long, always lead to a mind. Codes lead to intelligence. Now, homology is the idea that we have similar structures. You've seen this before, right? The dog leg, the bat wing, the seal arm, the human arm. Wow, they kind of have a similar structure here. And for many years, it was thought that the embryos looked the same. And man, that could be evidence of the fact that we all evolved. How many in here have ever heard of Haeckel's embryos? You guys ever heard of this, Haeckel's embryos? Well, Haeckel's embryos, I don't have time to get into it right now. It's in the book. Haeckel's embryos turned out to be faked. They're false. But even if they were true, it wouldn't matter. In other words, Haeckel doctored these drawings to make them look like they were similar when they were in embryonic stages, when they really were not. In any event, does this show that there must be intelligence, or that maybe it was a common ancestor? Let me ask you this question. Does similarity of structure prove that the pot evolved from the teaspoon? Well, you're saying, Frank, that's not a fair comparison. Other things are living things. These aren't living things. Yeah, well, guess what? Darwinists are using non-living things as illustrations. In fact, this came from Darwinist Tim Barra back in the 80s. He offered the progression of the Corvette as evidence of descent with modification. He said, look at the 53 Corvette, man. Well, the 63 looks like it kind of came from the 53. You know what? The 68 looked like it came from the 63. And the 78, you can see a progression there, right? Can anybody see the problem with this kind of reasoning? Corvettes are designed, exactly. This is now known as Barra's blunder because this is an illustration of intelligent design. It's not evidence of anything, it's just an illustration. He's using an illustration here, and it defeats his own argument. In fact, my co-author, Dr. Geisler, was arguing, or had a debate with a humanist by the name of Paul Kurtz many years ago, and they were going back and forth on this, and Kurtz actually said to Geisler, he said, you can see evolution, for example, in the airline industry, because we started with the Wright brothers plane, and now we're at the 747. And Geisler said, well, where did planes come from? Did they come from natural forces, or were they designed? And Kurtz kept trying to progress with this kind of analogy, and finally Geisler said, stop using that, you're helping my argument. You see, he forgets that there's intelligence involved here. So homology doesn't prove we have a common ancestor. It could mean we have a common creator. In fact, when we create things, we use common design, don't we? Almost every car, in fact, I'd venture to say every car in that parking lot has 4 tires. Unless you got one of those smart cars, which has a bicycle wheel and a couple of, well, whatever. 4 tires, why? Because 4 tires work well. The design works well for the purpose. Well, maybe this kind of design that we had up here a second ago when it came to the structure of appendages, maybe that kind of design works well in this kind of space-time continuum. And that's why the designer did it that way. You can't say just because they look similar, they must come from a common ancestor. No, maybe they came from a common creator. That's all we're saying here. In fact, let me read something here to you, and then we'll show it to you graphically, because this is the basis for Darwinism right here. Darwinists say that we know all of Earth's creatures share a common ancestor by way of unguided macroevolutionary processes because of DNA and homology. And how do we know that DNA and homology all point to a common ancestor rather than a common designer? Because macroevolution is true. Can you see this as circular reasoning? Actually, you can see it better this way. Actually, let me point out, science doesn't say anything, scientists do, all right? But let's look at it this way. This is circular reasoning. We have DNA and homology. We've got common DNA and we've got common structure, right? So we say, what caused that? Well, the Darwinists will say a common ancestor. Well, you ask the question, well, how do you know it's not a common designer? And how do they respond? They say, well, because evolution is true. And then you ask them, well, how do you know evolution is true? And they say what? Because of DNA and homology. Can you see this as circular? Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. Now, maybe the Darwinists are right. Maybe it is evidence of a common designer. Or I should say common ancestor. Maybe it is evidence of a common ancestor. Well, if it is, you need independent evidence to confirm that it is. You need something outside of DNA and homology to say so. And actually, there's evidence against this. Here's evidence against gradualism and for creation. One concept, which is in the book, which I have no time to get into tonight, is called irreducible complexity. How many have heard of irreducible complexity? Okay, there's a lot in the book about it. Michael Behe made it famous in his book, Darwin's Black Box. It basically says that things can't come into existence in a gradual process, certain things about certain biological entities, because all the pieces, all the parts have to be in one place in working order at the same time in order to have function. And if you take one part away, forget it. You can't get there gradually, in other words. I don't have time to get into that. I want to spend a little bit of time on the fossil record. And the reason for that is, contrary to popular opinion, the fossil record is a complete embarrassment for Darwinists. How so? There's something known as the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion, according to their dating, occurred 500-something million years ago. And what occurred then? All the major phyla, in other words, all the major body plans came into existence in a geological instant. It doesn't look like there were any precursors there. It doesn't look like an evolutionary process. Just bang, you get all these body plans in the fossil record at once. It's as if someone just placed them there. And there's a fabulous video out called Darwin's Dilemma, which goes through this. And I'm going to show you a very short clip from Darwin's Dilemma. You're going to see two gentlemen. One's name is Paul Nelson. Another guy is Stephen Meyer, the guy who wrote the book Signature in the Cell. And they will explain how this works, or how this Cambrian explosion, what the fossil record really looks like, I should say. That's what they're going to explain. Check this video out. It's only about a minute long.
Imagine a graph, if you will, of the appearance over time of phyla. In Darwin's picture, you'd have 1, then 2, then 4 perhaps, then 8, a gradually increasing curve of the number of phyla growing over time.
What you actually have in the fossil record is a sudden spike in the number of phyla that appear during the Cambrian, and then a few that trickle in across the rest of geologic time. This kind of discontinuity is radically at odds with the Darwinian picture of the history of life.
The pattern we see is the major body plans present at the beginning, and that the organisms that we know today fall into one or another of those major body plans. They don't gradually increase over time.
Guess what? This is uncontroversial with Dawkins. Dawkins admits this. Here's what he says. The Cambrian strata of rocks are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And we find many of them already in the advanced state of evolution. The very first time they appear, it is though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Does he have any explanation for this? No. Follow the evidence where it leads. He doesn't appear to want to do that. Now, you know the whole tree of life that we had up here earlier? How everything is interconnected according to Darwinists? Turns out the evidence does not support that. Instead of a tree, you know what the real illustration you ought to use? A lawn. Take a look at this. This is another short minute clip. This is Jonathan Wells explaining really what the truth is with regard to the fossil record. He is the guy that wrote the book Icons of Evolution. He's also a gentleman that wrote a new book called The Myth of Junk DNA. Check out what Wells says. Wells is going to be on the second part of this video.
The basic body plan of the arthropod phylum has a segmented torso, jointed legs, and an exoskeleton, all of which arose suddenly at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And today we still see the continuity of this original plan, this foundational idea, in over 1 million species of animals.
This top-down pattern looks nothing like the predictions of Darwin's theory.
Darwin's theory is that there's a tree of life where you have one organism diverging into many other organisms and big differences appearing at the top. What we really see is from here up. This does not exist in the fossil record. If I were using a botanical illustration, it would be a lawn with separate blades of grass sprouting independently of each other. And those would be the phyla. Now, within each phylum, there is subsequent diversification. But even there, I don't see the branches connecting that would make them a tree of life.
Darwin was caught in the grip of a deep dilemma. The fossil record showed him one thing, his theory told him something else. He comes to an impasse at this point, and he says, if this pattern holds, it is a genuine argument against my view. And I think 150 years later, we've added a great deal more detail to the picture, but I think the basic problem is still unsolved.
Without gradualism, we're back to a miracle. The fossil record does not support gradualism. That's why this man, Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard University, a famous evolutionist, came up with something called punctuated equilibria, where he thought that evolution took big jumps. Why? Because the fossil record showed there were these huge gaps. In fact, here's what Gould said. He said, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. He said, the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data at the tips and the nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. And guess what? Our friends at National Geographic agreed. I don't believe they put this quote in here, but this is the quote they made about the fossil record. Check this out. Illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 of every 1,000 frames have been lost on the cutting room floor. What's your definition of spotty? Imagine you go see a movie and they cut out 999 of every 1,000 frames. The movie's 47 seconds long. Do you skip out of there going, wow, what a plot. Wow, what great character development. Wow, that was just amazing. No, you go, I don't know what happened there. You don't have enough information. Well, this is what's going on right here. How are they coming to these conclusions with such sparse information? In fact, it appears that this is evidence against gradualism and evidence for instantaneous creation. In fact, what would the fossil record have to look like if creation were true? Exactly what it does. It would have to look like, bang, all the major body plans come into existence immediately without any precursors. That's what we find. In fact, this is the macroevolutionary theory. Do you know what the actual picture looks like? Here it is. Things just pop into existence, it appears. Now, it is true that the simpler creatures are older, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily ancestrally related. In fact, there aren't missing links, there's a missing chain. If you had one chain in New York, or I should say one link in New York, one link in Chicago, and another link in LA, would you have missing links or a missing chain? You'd have a missing chain. That's what we have here. We don't have missing links. It appears the evidence points to the fact that creation is true. Now, let me just do one more thing. You see these questions here? These are the questions you need to ask if you ever get into a conversation about evolution. I can't stand these presidential debates where they always ask, well, do you believe in evolution? My first question is always going to be question one. What do you mean by evolution? Because if you mean change over time, of course I agree with that. But if you mean from the goo to you via the zoo without intelligent intervention, no, I don't believe in that. Always ask the question, what do you mean by evolution? Do you mean micro? Yeah, I'm with you. Do you believe macro? No, I don't think there's evidence for that. Second question, how did you come to that conclusion? It's kind of the question that Philip Johnson asked Richard Dawkins. What evidence do you have for your view? Are you telling me that because we have DNA among all living things, that means we have a common ancestor? How do you know that? Could be a common creator. Could be a common designer. Could be we need to have DNA, all of us, to have a food chain. And then the last question is, have you ever considered the fact that the fossil record does not line up with gradualism? Have you ever considered the fact that homology could be evidence of a common designer rather than a common creator or a common ancestor? Have you ever considered the fact that irreducible complexity seems to preclude gradualism? Just ask the questions. That's a nice way for you, by the way, to offer some evidence back. So whenever you're involved in a conversation with somebody, by the way, it's not your job to refute what they say. It is their job to support what they say. So just ask the question. And by the way, these questions you can use with your teenagers. I think I'm going to be late. What do you mean by late? I'm not going to make it home. How'd you come to that conclusion? You know, you can use this for anything. These are good questions to get to the bottom line, all right? Now, as I said, I left a lot out. There's a lot more in the book, but we have very limited time here tonight. And if you'd hold your questions on this section, on the evolution section, in about 25 minutes we're going to take questions, but we have to do the third argument for the existence of God, if I can indulge you with this. And that will require us to go to what we call lesson 6. This is still in Does God Exist? The Moral Law.